So now that it's been 200 plus years, I think it's safe to say slavery was not the best move, morally at least. After we abolished slavery, but not really, some people thought some type of repentance was in order. But that repentance is often in America just being like, whoopsie, sorry. Other than that, there was some guy who was supposed to give land to all former slaves, but then he died, so he couldn't really follow through. Fast forward 200 plus years later, and we're still talking about it. So today's video was about that repentance, or as some call it, reparations. Now, usually when this is discussed, at least in the context of slavery, I see most responses being along the lines of, who's paying for this? Not me. How much do you even want? Slavery was forever ago. I shouldn't have to pay for my grandpa's actions, especially when there's no slaves left today. We had the Civil Rights Act. What more do you want? You gonna give Beyonce reparations? You know, maybe if you just worked a little harder, you wouldn't need reparations. Jim Crow and slavery are over. What's your excuse? And listen. I hear you, but hear me out. I promise not to take too much of your time, or I promise you'll have a more nuanced opinion. You know, ever since the name change, my videos don't feel valid unless they're over an hour. It's been a year of Philosynoir, given it's only been about 2 or 3 uploads in that year, but hey, it's still been a year. I take a long time because I want to bring you quality. Also, I must work a day job. Now, full disclosure to newcomers and returners, after researching for this video, I don't really think reparations will be paid out en masse by the US government, and part of me thinks reparations may not be the solution we think it is. However, my pessimism will not stop your craving for knowledge. You clicked on the video, so you want to learn about reparations, and today you will learn about reparations, and then some. Consider this the best video on YouTube on reparations. By the end of it, you'll be able to argue for reparations or against it, be able to give a brief history of the reparations movement all across the world, or at least in some parts of the world. I couldn't do the whole world. It's already an hour. And be able to answer any questions pertaining to reparations, understand why we probably should get reparations, but likely won't. Yay, America. USA. Starting with part 1. Slavery was a feature, not a bug. So this starts with the rise of capitalism, as most issues on this channel do. Earlier I said I don't expect reparations to be paid out en masse by the US government, and this section is why. Essentially, what one could be asking for is a repayment of a crucial part played in the development of the New World and the rise of capitalism. No biggie, probably just, what, a few bucks. I'm starting here to set the stage for the complexity of the reparations question, and also give you kind of an idea why the Black radical perspective of reparations often calls for the unaliving of capitalism. Many arguments for a reparations question center around slavery, and that makes sense, but I think it's a tad bit irresponsible actually to isolate the reparations discussion to slavery, because the exploitation didn't end there. But it is where it begun. This topic is complex and took a lot of reading. But I think I've gotten a good enough grasp to explain it to you. If you want the details for this section, I read Capitalism and Slavery, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean, and a few others that I'll link in the description. So, when it comes to reparations, while it is often posed as a moral question, it is also an economic one, as was the enslavement of Africans. What I mean by this is slavery was more economic than moral or even racial, at least in its beginning. So often slavery apologists, or as I call them, racists, would downplay the reasoning for African enslavement. One common lie that would be used is that Europeans simply couldn't withstand the climate of the New World, so they had to resort to Africa because, you know, Europeans were just so dainty and simply couldn't work the fields, which is a lie. There was a plethora of white servants doing work slaves would later do prior to the transatlantic slave trade. But a slave was more bang for your buck, colonially speaking. Stepping outside of America for a change, gasp. Take the Caribbean, for example. The West Indian economy entering the mid-20th century was structurally underdeveloped and underprepared for the economic challenges that come with nationhood. And this was the result of 3 centuries of British colonial trade policies. The slavery-based economies between the 1630s and 1820s pretty much assured the nation's social degradation and underdevelopment. The poverty of the African and Asian communities was sustained as a colonial norm and pretty much necessary to assure white economic control. White supremacy was pretty much baked into this nation's economy, and the enslavement of Africans was crucial to this process. Reparations comes up here because, as I said, reparations is an economic question. And since a lot of discussions are based around slavery, we'd have to make an argument that slavery provided economic benefit to the rise of the New World, which is pretty easy. I mean, it's cheap labor, unlike the white servant, like I said. This change in economic structure in the Caribbean, like other nations, produced two things: a change in the labor supply and the creation of an inferior social and economic organization of the exploiters and the exploited. And this was driven by three things: sugar, tobacco, and cotton. All of these require large plantations and a lot of cheap labor. Earlier I said a slave was more bang for your buck than a white servant, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that. Quoting from How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean, the tobacco of the small farmer in the Barbados was displaced by the sugar of the large plantation. The rise of the sugar industry in the Caribbean was a signal for a gigantic dispossession of the small farmer. Barbados in 1645 had 11,200 white small farmers and 5,680 Negro slaves. But in 1667, 745 large plantation owners and over 82,000 slaves. In 1645, the island had a little over 18,000 whites fit to bear arms. In 1667, only 8,300. The poor white small servants were pretty much squeezed out. They weren't fans of this, obviously, so they went disputing their way all over the Caribbean, from Barbados to Nevis to Antigua to Guyana and Trinidad and Carolina. Also, I'm sorry if I pronounced those places wrong. I have an English degree, but I can't read. But everywhere they went, they were pursued and dispossessed by the same economic force: sugar. And in Carolina, they were safe from cotton for only about 100 years. Between 1672 and 1708, the white men in Nevis decreased by more than 3/5, and the black population more than doubled. Between 1672 and 1727, the white males of Montserrat declined by more than 2/3. In that same period, the black population increased more than 11 times. This is my script if you're wondering what I'm looking at. The planters were pretty nervous about the growing disproportion between them and the slaves, so they passed defiancy laws to compel absentees to keep their white servants. And the absentees were like, we'd rather take the fine. This was a triumph not of geographical conditions, as slavery apologists or racists say, but of economics. The victims of this were obviously black people and the small white farmers. The increase of wealth for a few whites was as phenomenal as the increase of misery for black people. Now to talk about the economics a little bit more. The Barbados crops in 1650 over a 20-month period were worth over 3 million pounds. In 1666, Barbados was computed to be 17 times as rich as it was before the planting of sugar. 17 times as rich. Sugar was essentially a capitalist undertaking, obviously. And in such a society, there could only exist two classes: wealthy planters and oppressed slaves. And you could see similar patterns like this in Virginia, where instead of sugar, it was tobacco. In the early 17th century, about 2/3 of the landholders had neither slaves nor indentured servants. The strength of the colony lay in its numerous white yeomanry. Conditions became worse as the market for tobacco was gutted by Spanish competition, and Virginians demanded something be done about those petty English plantations in the savage islands of the West Indies. That's how I imagine they would say it. Nonetheless, though prices continued to fall, the exports of Virginia and Maryland increased more than 6 times between 1663 and 1699 because of slavery. It cheapened the cost of production. Slaves, 1/20 of the population in 1670, were 1/4 in 1730. Slaves went from being an insignificant factor in the life of the colony to the very foundation of which it was established. There was still room in Virginia for the small farmer, but the land was pretty much useless if you couldn't compete with slave labor. So the Virginian peasant, like the small Barbados farmer, was squeezed out. The Virginia, which had formerly been so largely the land of the little farmer, had become the land of the masters and slaves. It is said that the plantation system was less dependent upon slavery than slavery was upon it. The plantation system formed the industrial and social frame of the government, which slavery was a code of written laws enacted for that purpose. Where there weren't plantations, like in the Cuban tobacco industry, slave labor didn't really predominate, and it was mostly white servants. Slavery had created the tradition that manual labor was a badge of the slave and the sphere of influence of the Negro. White plantation workers could hardly have existed in a society side by side with Negro peasants. Slavery, therefore, was an only solution in the certain historical circumstances of the Caribbean labor problem. Slavery in no way implied, in any scientific sense, the inferiority of black people. This came later, and it was all bullshit. I talked about that in my last video. But without it, the development of the great sugar plantations in the Caribbean between 1650 and 1850 would not have been possible. The value of these Caribbean colonies can be presented by comparing individual Caribbean islands with individual mainland colonies. In 1697, British imports from the Barbados were 5 times the combined imports from the Brett colonies. Little Barbados was worth more to British capitalism than New York, Pennsylvania, and New England combined. Imports from Nevis were almost double those from New York. Imports from Jamaica nearly 6 times as large. For the same years, Jamaica as an export market was as valuable as New England. Barbados and Antigua combined meant as much to British exporters as New York, and Montserrat and Nevis combined were a better market than Pennsylvania. The triangular trade and the associated trade with the Sugar Islands, because of the navigation they encouraged, were more valuable to England than her mines of tin or coal. These were ideal colonies. Now, I know that was a lot, and one might say, well, they abolished slavery, so problem solved. Emancipation didn't solve these issues, and in a lot of ways, emancipation was a slap in the face to many of the ex-enslaved. Black workers were expected to fear freedom and not consider it the basis of an indigenous nation. Philosophers, economists, and sugar planters upgraded their political alliances, reasserting that the Emancipation Act was a strategic error. The Anti-Black Alliance sought to show the emancipated they were better off in a state of actual or near enslavement. At no point following emancipation did the British government agree with the leaders of the Black community that the future of the region could be based on a model of Black economic empowerment. There was a clear imperial perspective that the role of the Black community was to provide labor, not entrepreneurship. Yeah, we may have abolished slavery, but we are not giving you anything else. It was pretty much the vibes. By 1888, after 50 years of Black emancipation, white elites still held full economic control. Rising Black mortality coexisted with the hegemonic retention of white wealth. In England, John Stuart Mill, commenting on the case for Black entrepreneurship, called for a revised colonial policy that centered the economic enfranchisement of Africans and Asians. He argued that small farming culture could save the West Indies from further spread of famine, and he was called a communist. Whites were not prepared, even in the face of increasing mortality caused by famine, to release land for Black and Indian self-reliance and survival. Workers received no mitigating financial support from the British government. The majority of these communities understood that they were on their own, as they always had been. But the abolition of slavery didn't mean the abolition of the sugar plantation. The emancipation of Black people and the inadequacy of the white worker put the sugar plantation back to where he had been in the 17th century. He still needed labor. Deprived of the Negro, they turned from white then to Indian, this time to Indians from the East. The Caribbean replaced Africa between 1833 and 1917. Between 1833 and 1917, Trinidad imported over 140,000 East Indians. Between 1854 and 1883, 39,000 Indians were introduced into the Guadalupe, and between 1853 and 1922, over 22,000 laborers from the Dutch East Indies and 34,000 from British India were carried to Dutch Guiana. Whew, that was just a little bit about the Caribbean. But let's talk about Africa for a little bit. When Europeans reached the Americas, they recognized the enormous potential in gold and silver and tropical produce. But that potential could not be made a reality without an adequate labor supply. Europe had a very small population and could not afford to release the labor required to tap the wealth of the Americas. So they turned to the nearest continent, Africa, which luckily for them, and all of us, had the population accustomed to this type of agriculture. Now, before getting into this, one might say, well, Africa sold the slaves, so why shouldn't they pay the reparations? Which is a very silly question, but I'll answer it regardless. This section was quoted from How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and Walter Rodney notes that issues like who is responsible for slavery or who takes the blame weren't really the principal concern of his study, but he did note that they can be correctly approached after understanding that Europe became the center of the worldwide trade system and that it was European capitalism which set slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in motion. The slave trade in Africa was a response to external influences. Now we have to talk about America a bit. And this is because the dominant population was European, and because Europe transferred its capitalist institutions more completely to North America than any other part of the globe. It also established a powerful form of capitalism after eliminating the indigenous inhabitants and exploiting the labor of millions of Africans. The American colonies of the British Crown were used as means of accumulating primary capital for the re-export to Europe. The northern colonies also had direct access to the benefits from slavery in the American South and the British and French West Indies. As in Europe, the profits made from slavery and the slave trade went firstly to the commercial ports of the industrial areas, which mainly met the northeastern seaboard district known as New England and the state of New York. W.E.B. Du Bois, who we cannot escape on this channel, in his study of American slave trade quoted a report of 1862 as follows: "The number of persons engaged in the slave trade and the amount of capital embarked in it exceeded our powers of calculation. The city of New York has been until of late the principal port of the world for this infamous commerce, although the cities of Portland and Boston are only second to her in that distribution. American economic development up to the mid-19th century rested squarely on foreign commerce, of which slavery was a pivot. In the 1830s, slave-grown cotton accounted for about half the value of all exports from the United States. In the 19th century, the connection with Africa continued to play an indirect role in American political growth. Profits from slave activities went into coffers, political parties, and even more important, the African stimulation in black labor played a vital role in extending European control over the present territory of the USA, notably in the South. Europe maintained slavery in places that were physically remote from European society, and therefore inside of Europe itself, capitalist relations were elaborated without being adversely affected by slavery in America. However, even in Europe, there came a moment when the leading capitalist states found that the trade in slaves and the use of slave labor in America was no longer in the interest of their further development. Since capitalism, like any other mode of production, is a total system which involves an ideological aspect, it is also necessary to focus on the effects of the ties with Africa on the development of the ideas within the structure of European capitalist society, which is a complicated way of saying we should examine what capitalism did to the ideological aspect of America. The most striking ideological feature of capitalism is racism, obviously. That white racism, which came to pervade the world, was an integral part of the capitalist mode of production. It can even be argued that by the 19th century, white racism had become so institutionalized that it often ranked above the profit motive. All that being said, obviously, the labor wasn't compensated, and people should be compensated for their work, correct? Or we can at least agree that slavery was bad, so something probably should have been done, right? So why is it when we talk about slavery, people clutch their pearls? Anyway, all that being said, I think we can agree that emancipation was not the end-all be-all and a good reparations for slavery. I mean, it's a great start for sure, but definitely not enough. And the weird part is that we've given reparations before to other groups of people, but just not for slavery. Which brings me to my next section. So something often brought up when I was researching for this video is that reparations have been paid to other groups of people, but just not for slavery. And even talk of studying it in the US makes people nervous. It was just this year when a bill HR 40 was set to have enough votes in the House to pass after being introduced 40 years ago. The bill would establish a commission to examine slavery and discrimination in the United States from 1619 to present and recommend appropriate remedies. Even though HR 40 didn't call for any money or land to be paid to black people, it still had people nervous, which is weird because, like I've said, we've given reparations to other groups of people, just not for slavery. Which is why this section is cleverly titled, Reparations Paid to Everyone But Black People. One example is when Reagan established the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. This granted reparations to Japanese Americans who had been interned by the US government in World War II. It was said to grant each surviving internee about $20,000, which is about $40,000 in today's money. Or, just as notable, reparations paid to Jewish people for the Holocaust. When the Western Allies failed to respond to Israel's call for reparations, West Germany did. On November 11, 1949, their chancellor stated, "The German people resolved to make good the wrong done to the Jews in their name by the critical regimen. This reparation we regard as our duty." The official negotiations between Israel and Germany lasted about 5 months. Germany was to pay about 3 billion marks, which at the time in US dollars would have been 715 million, and in today US dollars would have been 6,568 million. The purpose of these funds was to help Israel resettle the 500,000 displaced persons at an average of 13,000 per person in 2016 US dollars. Also, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims received a lump sum of 45 million. A final component of the agreement was West Germany's pledge to enact new legislation for individual compensation. West Germany honored her obligations under the agreement, which included an element of open-ended compensation. In 1953, West Germany passed the Federal Supplementary Law for Federal Supplementary Law for the Compensation of Victims of National Socialist Persecution. They really need to workshop that title. And this was followed up by the Federal Compensation Terminal Law, which allows some 146,000 Israeli residents and some 36,000 non-Israeli residents to receive payments from Germany by the 1980s. And also, in 1988, the West German government paid another US $200 million to a little over 71,000 remaining Holocaust survivors. And this was a little over 5,000 for each remaining victim. Also in 1999, Germany agreed to compensate Jewish and non-Jewish enslaved laborers. The amount was paid out to, at the time, 1.7 million surviving laborers enslaved by the Nazis, for an average of a little over 4,000 for each victim in US 2016 dollars. Overall, Germany has paid, what the fuck is even this number? 15 trillion? This amount, it'll be on the screen. So this provides some legal problems and political solutions for the reparations question. German Holocaust reparations were paid for crimes against humanity that were committed before they became formally legal in international law. The legal context for slavery and the slave trade is a little bit similar. They weren't formally ruled illegal in international law until 1926, but they were against the law in most slave trading nations while it lasted. In England, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, slavery was illegal in a European territory and only gradually tolerated in colonial overseas possessions. Portugal and Spain came closest to legally recognizing slavery, but only as a result of captivity in a quote-unquote just war. Kidnapping Africans did not qualify as legal enslavement. It can also be argued that the slave trade was also illegal from the perspective of most African nations at the time. Let's put a pin in that. This leads us to the question of whether reparations will ultimately result from legal actions. Holocaust reparations did not result from legal judgment, but from a political process where the people who committed the crime reached out to the people who were victims of the crime. And slavery reparations may have to result from something similar, and you can take of that what you will. So, reparations have been paid to Japanese Americans, Jewish people, and now let's talk about reparations paid to people who didn't deserve it. One example could be the Haitian independence debt, which is the most fucked thing, oh my god. So the Haitian independence debt was a reaction to the Haitian Revolution, where France made Haiti pay money towards slave owners because they lost their property. After Haiti won its independence from France in 1804, it made a lot of world powers very nervous. I mean, it was a black-led nation created by slaves who fought against their slave owners and kicked them out of town. Haiti, at the time known as Saint Dominic, had been a crown jewel of the French Empire. It was the most lucrative colony in the whole world. French planters forced African slaves to produce sugar, coffee, and other cash crops for the global market. It seemed to work well, but that is until the French and American revolutions happened and inspired Haiti to also start a revolution. The most successful slave revolt in history, the Haitian Revolution. This revolution resulted in Haiti becoming the first nation to permanently ban slavery. But as a nation of free black slaves, Haiti was a threat to the existing world power. President Thomas Jefferson worked hard to isolate Haiti diplomatically and strangle it economically, fearing that the success of Haiti would inspire slave revolts back home. In 1825, France threatened Haiti, basically saying, pay 150 million francs to secure their independence or suffer the consequences. That 150 million was more than 10 times what the US paid to France in the Louisiana Purchase. Haiti caved to France's demands in order to secure their independence. The amount was too much for the young nation to pay for itself, so they took out loans with hefty interest to pay France back. In 2004, the government of Haiti filed a legal brief to request not reparations for slavery, but simply a repayment of Haiti's independence debt. Haitian economist Francis St. Hubert conservatively computed the present value figure of the amount with a 5% interest and arrived at the amount of $21,685,135,571.48. The Haitian independence debt was distributed to 7,900 slave owners and their descendants for an average of $4 million per person. Like France, Britain paid money to slave owners and not slaves after abolition. Remember earlier when I said emancipation was a slap in the face to a lot of the ex-enslaved? Well, this part will tell you why. The Abolition Act, approved in 1833, was given the title An Act for the Abolition of Slavery throughout the British colonies for promoting the industry of manumitted slaves and for compensating the person hereafter entitled to the services of such slave. Jesus fucking Christ, why can't they write shorter titles? So this act pretty much confirmed that the enslavers were the legal owners of the enslaved and therefore entitled to compensation. The Emancipation Act then effectively deemed enslaved people non-human. Parliament proceeded to compensate slave owners as a matter of property right reparations. Emancipation was crafted and designed as a legal adjustment to the extraction model. The intention was to upgrade the system of labor exploitation. Long-term bondage was inscribed into the provisions of the law. 200 years of enslavement, the act implied, had not achieved their objective completely. So earlier I said that money was paid to slave owners, not slaves, and this meant the transfer of over 47 million euros to the slave investor class and the British nation. So another reparations paid to slave owners was that after black people were emancipated, they would have to work for the slave owners for an additional 6 years under the guise of an apprenticeship to help them get ready for emancipation and being a citizen. Mind you, this was an additional period of free labor for them. The principal purpose of this was to make the formerly enslaved pay 50% for their cost of emancipation. They made them pay for their own emancipation. Slave owners with $20 million in cash ran to the bank. The $25 million paid, quote unquote, in kind by the enslaved added to the plunder. Nicholas Draper has shown that the 20 million represented 40% of British national expenditure. The package of cash plus interest plus the value of the 6-year apprenticeship totaled 96% of the market value of the enslaved, and the deal compromised 49% cash and 47% apprenticeship. The enslaved therefore paid between a fifth and one-half the cost of their freedom. Former Prime Minister David Cameron's ancestors were among the wealthy families who received these generous reparations payments that today will be worth millions of dollars. Dr. Nick Draper from the University College of London, who studied the compensation papers, says that as many as 1/5 of wealthy Victorian Britons derived all or part of their wealth from the slave economy. The guy named John Austin, for example, who owned about 415 slaves, was compensated over $20,000, which will be nearly 20 million today. And there are some who receive far more than that. Academics from University College London, including Draper, spent 3 years drawing together 40,000 records of compensation given to British slave owners into an internet database. But he emphasized that the claims set to be unveiled were not just from rich families, but included very many ordinary men and women. It implies that there probably are some people who aren't rich whose ancestors benefited from slavery. The TV chef Ainsley Harriott, who had slave owners in his family, had said he was shocked by the amount paid out by the government to the slave owners. You would think that the government would at least have given some money to the freed slaves who needed to find homes and start new lives. It seems a bit barbaric. It's like the rich protecting the rich. And of course, a similar example can be pointed to in the United States. And this was the District of Columbia Emancipation Act. This gave former slave owners $300 per slave they formerly owned, for a total cost in excess of $930,000, almost $25 million in today's money. And of course, the formerly enslaved received no compensation, which is why we're here. But credit where credit's due, they did offer an immigration incentive of about $100 to $200 for Black people to leave the United States and never come back. Similar examples of reparations going to slave owners can be pointed to in Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Argentina, Colombia, Paraguay, Venezuela, Peru, and Brazil. So I mentioned the reparations paid to slave owners and Black people to make the argument that obviously you can do reparations. It has been done before, and it's not unheard of to give reparations to people for crimes against humanity. So despite many governments' reluctance to give reparations to slaves and their descendants, many people have still attempted to get reparations, each attempt setting the stage for the next. And the question they often start with is, what is owed? Is a question we'll be trying to tackle a little bit. There have been many movements for slave reparations, but very few have led to broad-scale payments, and where there has been payment, it's typically been on an individual basis. Take Henrietta Wood or Belinda Royal, for example. Belinda Royal petitioned the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for her reparations. She was born in modern-day Ghana and kidnapped and sold into slavery. She endured 50 years of enslavement under the hands of Isaac Royal and his son, and her story of having a happy life until being sold into slavery persuaded the general court to grant her reparations. Henrietta Wood was born a slave, but then kidnapped and sold back into slavery as an adult, even though she was free. She would later go on to sue her kidnappers and win financial damages. But these are just some of the individual cases, and as I said, when it comes to broad-scale cases, very few have succeeded. One of the first attempts that you probably know of was 40 Acres and a Mule. This came from General Sherman's Field Order Number 15, and it was going to give land to all former slaves, and it actually did work, and land was given to former slaves, but then Andrew Johnson, the guy after Abraham Lincoln died, by the way, that was an important part. After Honest Abe died, the guy after him, Andrew Johnson, gave the land back to the former slave owners. Then his guy Thaddeus Stevens kind of felt bad, so he tried to get the land back to the slaves, but then Andrew Johnson said, fuck that, no, and vetoed the bills. For context, the price of an acre in 2021 was over $3,000, so times that by 40, and that would be over $135,000. And accounting for the population of ex-slaves at the time, that would have been this number I cannot read. Then there was the Homestead Act, which almost worked. Ex-slaves were given 6 months to get land without competition from white Southerners or Northern investors. But until the U.S. abolished slavery and passed the 14th Amendment, most Black people, ex-slaves or not, couldn't get this land. And the largest number they did find was in Florida, where it was only a little over 3,000. So that was a bust. Now, when it comes to one of the first reparations movements led by Black people in the United States, it would be the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief and Bounty Pension Association. This group wanted to get reparations for ex-slaves, mainly elderly ex-slaves, and also provide mutual aid and burial expenses. Two of its most notable leaders, Callie D. House and Isaiah H. Dickerson, were under strong government surveillance, but they didn't know at the time. The Post Department started issuing fraud orders against the organization, and then one thing led to another. Isaiah H. Dickerson died, and Callie D. House became the leader of the broader movement and organization. But the Post Department didn't stop with their fraud orders, which were bullshit, by the way. One thing leads to another, Khalidi House is arrested, and the organization and the broader movement kind of dies out. We also have the Black Manifesto. This was led by James Forman in 1969, but instead of charging the government or even ex-enslavers, James Forman charged Christian churches and Jewish synagogues. The manifesto originally only demanded $500 million, but James Forman later responded to some critics and raised it from $500 million to $3 billion. And they were going to do whatever it took to get this money. Disruptions, demonstrations, you name it. The money obtained would provide for the funding of a Southern land bank, 4 publishing houses, 4 TV networks to counter racist propaganda, a research skills center, a research for training and communications, a grant to the National Welfare Rights Organization, a National Black Labor Strike and Defense Fund, and an International Black Appeal headed by James Forman. A lot of churches responded to the manifesto with criticism or praise, but none of them gave the money up and they just donated to existing programs. There's also a prominent reparations movement in Africa. I believe I mentioned earlier that they did request reparations, but not for slavery, only a repayment of this independence step. But in 2000, there was a proposed reparations for slavery by population loss. This included casualties of wars fought for the purpose of enslavement, deaths on the transport route from interior to coast, deaths on the voyage out of Africa, and those who survive outside of Africa, as well as potential descendants of the dead and actual descendants of the surviving victims. Osabukuli arrives at the estimate of over 1 billion human lives lost. They write, how can this cost in human loss to Africa be converted into US dollars? Based on the Warsaw Convention for assigning value of loss of human life, compensation for each human life irrespective of race when an aircraft crashes in the US, $75,000. Hence, the present value reparation for human loss to Africa alone is 75 trillion US dollars. In 2016 dollars, this would amount to over 100,000 for each aircraft crash, over 106 trillion for human life lost in the transatlantic slave trade. In 1990, The Wealth of Races appeared with various reparation estimates for slavery and racial discrimination since emancipation. This book contains 3 proposals specifically for slavery reparations in the United States, covering the period from 1776 to 1865. Ramsden and Stutch estimate the total debt from slavery in the United States to amount to 17 billion. Neal estimates it to be about 1.4 trillion and Marchetti to 4.7 trillion. This is all in US 1983 dollars. 2016 dollars, this would represent 41.54 billion, 3.42 trillion, and 11.48 trillion. And per Afro-descendant, $888, $73,000, and $245,000. Calculated with only 3% interest, this would amount to 17 trillion in 2016 dollars, or 374,000 per Afro-descendant. And if you raise this from 3% to 4% interest, it amounts to almost $116 trillion in 2016 dollars, which would be about 2.5 million per Afro-descendant. America would never. They barely wanted to give us stimulus checks. But those are just some of the most prominent ones I could find. What's also interesting is there has been reparations paid to Black people for things that weren't slavery. This is typically for some type of systemic violence. Take the reparations paid to the victims of the Tuskegee experiment. The purpose of this study was to see what syphilis does when untreated. The Black men involved in this experiment weren't aware what was going on, and over 100 died as a result. Told this experiment was going to last 6 months. It lasted 40 years. Funding for this experiment was lost, and the study continued without anyone telling the Black men that they would never be treated. None of the infected men were treated with penicillin, despite the fact it was widely available and the go-to treatment for syphilis. In 1997, Bill Clinton apologized on behalf of the US government. This led to a $10 million out-of-court settlement. North Carolina also paid reparations for sterilization experiments they did. North Carolina wasn't the only state sterilizing Black people. It kind of fell out of favor after the Nazis got popular, but North Carolina said no, we're gonna expand it. And this also led to some type of reparations. There's also been reparations for descendants of past white hate mobs that destroyed Black wealth, such as in Rosewood. This gave $150,000 to living survivors and also free tuition at the local college to their descendants. Though apparently some of the students who got this feel kind of iffy because it only provides for 4 years, and sometimes you take more than 4 years to graduate. In fact, most students take more than 4 years to graduate. It's not abnormal to graduate in 5 years. I'm normal. There's also been a handful of colleges and churches who have given reparations to descendants of slaves who helped build their institution. So there have been some small scale wins, but on a broad level, nothing yet. But if reparations were to happen on a broad level, what exactly would that look like minus over $100 trillion given to Black people? Because let's be real, they're not doing that. They're not, listen to me, they're not doing that. But I can think of a few alternatives. As for starters, an apology. Well, actually, when I was researching for this video, there were a lot of apologies counted as reparations, but Apologies can be cashed out, babes, but still a formal apology from the US government would acknowledge that, you know, they care, I guess, or at least willing to show that they will pretend that they care. Now, in terms of execution, the National African American Commission on Reparations has a 10-point plan, which I think is a good start. It includes a formal apology for slavery and also the establishment of an African Holocaust Institute, the creation of an African Knowledge Program, the right to land for social and economic development, funds for cooperative enterprise and socially responsible entrepreneurial development, resources for health, wellness, and healing of Black families and communities, education for community development and empowerment, affordable housing for healthy Black communities and wealth, strengthening Black America's information and communications, preserving Black sacred sites and monuments, repairing the damages of the quote criminal injustice system. Now for some criticisms, which is the part of the video I've been waiting for. Someone really prominent in his reparation talks is Ta-Nehisi Coates. He wrote this article on reparations that got really popular a few years back. I read some of it for this video and it was a pretty decent article, but what I wasn't ready for was the critiques of him. One notable one being by Professor Turi F. Reed, who basically writes that reparations is a political dead end and sees reparations as a way for white liberals and even some conservatives to ease their consciousness in so-called racial sins. Another critique I really enjoyed was Cedric Johnson's. He says a lot of activists are employing the language of reparative justice, like in the cases of the John Burge torture settlements. Burge cases is something I went over in my abolition video. If you don't know about the John Burge cases, just the short of it is John Burge is a piece of shit, the biggest piece of shit, the scum of the earth, actually. What a compensation paid to the victims of the North Carolina sterilization program. But he writes that these cases are not the same as the demand for slavery reparations. As was said earlier, these were cases for the legal category of victim, while slavery reparations are a more complex scenario for intergenerational events, and likely won't be rectified through the same legal strategy as the John Burge cases or the North Carolina sterilization cases or anything like that. He also says not all Black people will support reparations, nor should all Black people be recipients of reparations. So parsing out who deserves redress and who doesn't, and who should pay up, we end up right back where we started, redressing the inequality that exists between classes, a multiracial investor class on one side, and a multiracial laboring class on the other. We can't go back in time and address slavery, dispossession, and debt peonage as they were unfolding. By default, we are stuck with addressing oppression in our midst, which is descended from a longer history, but actively determined by a contemporary process, foremost being the production and realization of surplus value in our world. He goes on to say that it isn't clear that some of these pro-reparation arguments would be more effective than the proven methods of addressing Black inequality, such as effective enforcement of anti-discrimination laws and enhanced support for institutions like historically Black colleges. I mean, how about instead of asking for over $20 trillion, we gave every Black child free admission to college, or just made college free? What if every Black person got a free ticket to whichever African country they're descended from? Or Black business grants? What if instead of having statues of slave owners, we had statues of prominent slave rebellion leaders? What if we had schools intent on sending children to college and not to jail? What if you checked out my Patreon and paid me reparations for the blood, sweat, and tears I put in this video? I'm kidding, obviously. Not really. I've seen your deleted tweets and drafts. This is a threat. And it's the holidays. Just handing out money doesn't guarantee it will stay in the community, and even if money does get handed out, which I highly doubt it will likely be treated as shut the fuck up money. Here's some money, now stop teaching people America is bad. You're being mean. So when you hear talk of reparations, remember, for one, slavery isn't the only debt that needs to be paid, and that no one is asking you, random white person, to pay reparations. It's a charge against the government. And there you have it, the best video on reparations that will ever be made in the history of any type of media. Any questions, concerns, things you feel like I should have brought up in the video? Feel free to leave them in the comment section, and until next time, bye! Check out the Patreon.